10 minutes. That's all it took for me to hand him divorce papers at his father's retirement party, right after his palm struck my face in front of 200 guests. The crack of his hand across my face echoed through the banquet hall, but it was his entitled smile that ended our 7-year marriage. 10 minutes was all it took to dismantle the carefully constructed facade of the city's most respected family. Before we begin, I want to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey of healing and empowerment. If you're finding strength in these stories of transformation, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build a community of survivors who refuse to be silenced. Let's dive in. I'd always known this moment would arrive, though I never imagined it would unfold during his father's grand retirement celebration at the prestigious Sterling Hotel. 200 guests, the city's elite, gathered to honor Thomas Mitchell's 30 years as CEO of Mitchell Industries. The champagne flowed freely, crystal glasses catching the light from the antique chandeliers, the same chandeliers that would soon witness their dynasty's undoing. Alexander stood there, 6'4", of inherited privilege, adjusting his custom Italian suit as he prepared to give the keynote speech about his father's legacy. I watched him from my seat at the head table, noting how his manicured hands smoothed down his silk tie, the same hands that had left bruises I'd become expert at concealing. His mother, Catherine, sat perfectly poised beside me, her designer dress and practiced smile masking decades of silent submission. The same smile I'd watched her teach my sister-in-law Rachel to perfect over countless charity luncheons. The ballroom buzzed with Boston's most influential names, judges, senators, CEOs, all raising their glasses to toast Thomas Mitchell's illustrious career. If they only knew what lay beneath the polished surface of the Mitchell family empire. I felt the weight of the manila envelope in my clutch, 7 years of evidence carefully collected and preserved, waiting for precisely this moment. A true Mitchell man knows how to keep his house in order. Thomas had often preached at family gatherings, his voice carrying that familiar note of superiority that Alexander had inherited along with the family business. Tonight, those words would take on a whole new meaning. I'd chosen this moment carefully. 7 years of methodical planning, of documenting every backroom deal, every offshore account, every business dinner with his young secretaries. 7 years of building an arsenal while playing the role of the perfect corporate wife. Little did they know I hadn't spent my years at Harvard Law just to become their picture-perfect accessory. The signs had been there from the beginning, though I'd been too blinded by ambition to see them clearly. Alexander's controlling nature had emerged slowly, like poison seeping into a well. First, it was subtle suggestions about my wardrobe. A Mitchell wife needs to maintain certain standards. Then came the monitoring of my career. The firm's environmental cases might conflict with our family's interests, darling. Before long, I found myself gradually pushed out of my own law practice, steered instead toward organizing charity galas and sitting on museum boards. I watched him now, commanding the room's attention as he had always commanded mine. His voice carried across the ballroom as he spoke about his father's legacy of integrity and family values. The irony wasn't lost on me. Behind me, I could hear Rachel's husband James whispering to her about some perceived fault in her table etiquette. She ducked her head slightly, that same practiced movement I'd seen countless times, the Mitchell women's choreographed dance of submission. Catherine touched my arm gently, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. Darling, you seem tense. Remember, tonight is about family. Her words carried the weight of unspoken warnings, the same gentle reminders she'd used whenever I showed signs of defiance. Little did she know that tonight would redefine exactly what family meant in the Mitchell dynasty. I felt the slight tremor in my hands as Alexander concluded his speech, making his way back to the head table. 7 years of gathering evidence, of secretly building my own network, of preparing for this moment. It all came down to the next few minutes. The offshore accounts I'd uncovered, the whistleblower testimonies I'd collected, the paper trail of harassment settlements I'd documented, all of it carefully preserved and ready to destroy the facade of respectability they'd spent generations building. You're awfully quiet tonight, Alexander murmured as he took his seat beside me, his hand possessively gripping my knee under the table. I hope you're not planning to embarrass me by bringing up that ridiculous pro bono work again. His smile remained fixed, perfect for any photographers catching the moment, but his fingers dug deeper into my skin. I met his gaze steadily, 7 years of suppressed strength rising to the surface. Actually, Alexander, I have something else in mind entirely. My hand tightened around my clutch, feeling the weight of the documents inside. The evidence that would not only free me but expose the true nature of the Mitchell men to the world. The time had come to show them that I'd learned far more at Harvard than just how to be a trophy wife. I'd learned how to build a case, piece by piece, until it became an undeniable weapon of truth. And tonight, at the height of their celebration, I would use that weapon to shatter their kingdom of lies. The breaking point came during the champagne. Toast. Alexander had just finished circling the room, playing the role of devoted son and heir, a parent to perfection. His charm was almost hypnotic. I'd seen it work its magic countless times over the years. The same charisma that had once drawn me in now made my skin crawl as I watched him masterfully manipulate everyone around him. To the Mitchell legacy, Thomas declared, raising his crystal flute. 200 voices echoed the sentiment, the sound reverberating off the ornate ceiling. I raised my own glass mechanically, the practiced motion of a corporate wife who knew her role all too well. But tonight, that role would reach its final curtain. The moment crystallized as I watched Alexander's interaction with his new executive, assistant Emma. She couldn't have been more than 25, her youth and ambition radiating as clearly as my own had 7 years ago. The way he leaned in slightly too close, his hand brushing her arm with practiced casualness, it was a scene I'd witnessed dozens of times before. Each new assistant, each private meeting, each hushed settlement handled discreetly by the family attorneys, all of it meticulously documented in the files weighing down my clutch. Sarah? Catherine's voice cut through my thoughts, razor-sharp beneath its silk veneer. You're staring, dear. Remember what we discussed about maintaining appropriate appearances. Her perfectly manicured hand touched my arm, a gesture that might have appeared maternal to observers, but carried the weight of years of calculated control. I turned to face my mother-in-law, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. The fine lines around her eyes, etched deeper by years of looking the other way. The slight tremor in her hand as she raised her champagne glass, masked by practiced elegance but betraying the cost of her silence. She'd spent 4 decades perfecting this performance, teaching it to each new generation of Mitchell women. Rachel, Alexander's sister, was her pride and joy in that regard, already well-versed in the art of silent suffering at 32. Of course, Catherine, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through my veins. Appearances are everything to the Mitchells, aren't they? Something in my tone must have alerted her well-tuned radar. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the only visible crack in her perfect facade. Alexander chose that moment to return to our table, his hand landing possessively on my shoulder. Everything all right here? He asked, though his tone carried more warning than concern. The weight of his hand increased slightly. Another warning, one I'd felt countless times before. Your wife seems a bit out of sorts tonight, Catherine offered, her voice carrying that particular tone that had preceded so many of our private conversations about proper Mitchell wife behavior. Perhaps the excitement of the evening is too much for her. I watched Alexander's jaw tighten, saw the slight shift in his stance that I'd learned to read so well over the years. To anyone else, he still appeared the perfect gentleman, the devoted husband concerned for his wife's welfare. But I knew what was coming. 7 years of experience had taught me to read every minute signal, every subtle tell that preceded his explosions. Sarah, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I knew too well. Why don't we step outside for a moment? You clearly need some air. His fingers dug deeper into my shoulder, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. Actually, I replied, my voice carrying clearly across the table, I think it's time we all had a frank discussion about the Mitchell family's definition of proper behavior. I reached for my clutch, feeling the reassuring weight of 7 years' worth of evidence inside. The change was immediate. Alexander's face hardened, the mask of civility slipping just enough for those paying attention to see the truth beneath. Thomas stopped mid-conversation with a business associate, his instinct for threats to his carefully constructed world still sharp after all these years. Catherine's hand froze halfway to her mouth, her champagne trembling slightly in its crystal prison. Sarah. Alexander's voice carried that familiar warning tone, the one that had preceded thrown objects and broken promises. This is neither the time nor the place for your dramatic outbursts. I stood slowly, every eye at the head table now fixed on our interaction. Rachel watched with barely concealed panic, recognizing the patterns she'd seen play out so many times before. James, her husband, shifted uncomfortably, his own hands clenching slightly on the tablecloth. On the contrary, I said, my voice steady and clear, I can't think of a better time to discuss the true Mitchell legacy. After all, isn't that what we're here to celebrate? I began to open my clutch, and I saw real fear flash across Alexander's eyes for the first time in our marriage. Sit. Down. Each word came through clenched teeth, his public mask slipping further with each passing second. The guests nearest our table had begun to notice the tension, their own conversations dying down as they sensed the approaching storm. That's when I made my final mistake. Or perhaps it was the universe giving me exactly what I needed. I looked him directly in the eyes and said, No, Alexander, I don't think I will. In fact, I think it's time everyone here learned exactly what it means to be a Mitchell man. His hand moved faster than I expected, the crack of palm against cheek, echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. 200 glasses froze midway to 200 mouths. The perfect facade of the Mitchell family shattered with that single sound, the truth of their dynasty written in the red mark spreading across my face. Time seemed to crystallize in that moment. The sting of his palm against my cheek pulsed in, rhythm with my heartbeat, but it wasn't pain I felt. It was pure, crystalline clarity. The ballroom had fallen into a silence so complete you could hear the ice settling in 200 abandoned champagne glasses. In that perfect stillness, I allowed myself one small smile. Thank you, Alexander, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly through the shocked silence. You've just made this so much easier. I touched my cheek gently, noting how Catherine had already begun her practiced damage control routine, her hands fluttering like trapped birds as she tried to salvage the unsalvageable. Ladies and gentlemen, I continued, turning to face the crowd of Boston's elite, many of whom had their phones raised, capturing the moment the Mitchell dynasty began to crumble. I believe we've just witnessed a perfect example of the Mitchell family values Thomas was so proudly speaking about earlier. Alexander lunged forward, but 2 of the younger partners from his law firm, men who had witnessed similar episodes in the office, instinctively moved to restrain him. His face had transformed into something ugly, something that no amount of family money or social polish could disguise. You manipulative bitch, he snarled, all pretense of refinement gone. After everything this family has given you, given me. I opened my clutch deliberately, removing the thick manila envelope. I'd prepared. Let's talk about what this family has really given me, Alexander. 7 years of documented abuse? The systematic dismantling of my legal career? Or perhaps we should discuss what you've given all those young assistants who mysteriously resign and receive generous severance packages? Thomas Mitchell rose from his seat, his face a thundercloud of rage and fear. That's enough! Security! But the security team hesitated, their eyes fixed on the envelope in my hands. I'd made sure to visit each of them earlier, sharing copies of the evidence that implicated the Mitchell security force in covering up years of Alexander's indiscretions. "Oh, I don't think they'll be intervening, Thomas," I said calmly. "They're far too professional to risk their careers by becoming further entangled in your family's criminal activities." I began distributing copies of selected documents to the nearest tables. "You see, I've spent the last 7 years building quite a comprehensive case." The rustle of papers being passed from hand to hand filled the ballroom. I watched as prominent judges, business leaders, and society figures began to really read, about the true nature of the Mitchell empire. Their faces transformed from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. "Page 3 is particularly interesting," I announced, my law school training serving me well. "It details the offshore accounts where Mitchell Industries has been hiding profits from environmental cleanup violations. And page 7? That's a list of every settlement paid to silence Alexander's victims, complete with dates, amounts, and the names of the attorneys who facilitated the cover-ups." Catherine's champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd in silence. Whispers erupted like wildfire, phones appeared in hands, and I could practically see the Mitchell family's carefully constructed reputation dissolving in real time. "You've had 7 years to teach me what it means to be a Mitchell woman," I said, turning back to Catherine. "7 years of your careful instruction in keeping quiet, maintaining appearances, and looking the other way. But you forgot one crucial detail. I was a lawyer before I was ever a Mitchell." Rachel had risen from her seat, her face a mixture of terror and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Her husband, James, had backed away from the table, his own expression suggesting he was rapidly recalculating his position in the Mitchell hierarchy. "The full documentation has already been sent to the SEC, the Environmental Protection Agency, and several major news outlets," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "But I wanted to give you, all of you, the courtesy of hearing it first. Consider it my parting gift to the family." Alexander had stopped struggling against his colleague's restraint, his face now ashen as the full implications began to sink in. "You can't prove any of this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I withdrew my phone, holding it up so he could see the screen. "Actually, I can. Remember that little habit you have of boasting about your clever financial maneuvers after your third scotch? I certainly do. And so does my voice recorder app. 7 years of documented conversations, Alexander. 7 years of you and your father detailing exactly how you've maintained the Mitchell family's power through corruption, intimidation, and abuse." Thomas Mitchell had begun to sway slightly in his seat, his complexion taking on an alarming shade of gray. His wife's carefully crafted retirement celebration had transformed into the public execution of their family's reputation, and there wasn't a thing any of them could do to stop it. "The papers you're holding," I addressed the crowd, "are just copies. The originals, along with hours of recorded conversations, photographs, and sworn statements from former employees, are in secure locations with instructions for release if anything unfortunate should happen to me." I touched my reddened cheek again, knowing the cameras were still rolling. "Though I suppose we've already crossed that threshold, haven't we, Alexander?" The sounds of sirens became audible in the distance. Right on schedule. I'd timed my revelations perfectly, knowing that at least one of the guests would contact authorities about the assault they'd witnessed. The fact that several FBI agents would be arriving with them was just another piece of my carefully orchestrated plan. "I'd suggest everyone remain in their seats," I said calmly. "I believe there are some federal agents who'd like to ask a few questions about certain creative accounting practices detailed in those documents. Catherine?" I turned to my mother-in-law, whose perfect composure had finally cracked completely. "I won't be attending next week's charity luncheon. I have a feeling you'll be rather busy with damage control." The first police officers entered the ballroom just as Alexander broke free from his colleague's grasp. He lunged toward me, his face contorted with rage, but froze as multiple phones recorded his movement. Even in his fury, years of image consciousness made him hesitate. 7 years, I said softly, meeting his eyes. 7 years of playing the perfect wife, while I documented every abuse, every crime, every moment of cruelty. You taught me well, Alexander. You taught me exactly how much evidence I'd need to bring down not just you, but the entire Mitchell empire. Consider this my divorce filing. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of chaos. FBI agents in dark suits moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, securing exits and collecting documents. The glamorous retirement party had transformed into a crime scene, complete with photographers documenting evidence instead of social moments for the society pages. Thomas Mitchell was being questioned in a corner, his face purple with barely contained rage as he watched his empire crumbling in real time. Catherine had retreated to a chair by the wall, her perfect posture finally broken as she stared blankly at her phone, watching the first news alerts begin to pop up. The Mitchell family scandal was already trending on social media. Mrs. Mitchell? A female FBI agent approached me, her badge identifying her as Special Agent Chen. We'd like to take your statement about the assault we witnessed on the security footage. She paused, glancing at the documents still being passed among the shocked guests. And perhaps discuss some of this other evidence as well. I smiled, reaching into my clutch for another envelope. Of course, Agent Chen. I've prepared a complete timeline of events, including dates, locations, and witnesses for every incident documented in those files. I believe you'll find it matches perfectly with the evidence my team sent to your office earlier today. Alexander's head snapped up at that, his face contorting with fresh rage. Your team? He spat, still restrained by 2 officers. What team? You really think I orchestrated all this alone? I asked, enjoying the way his eyes widened with dawning comprehension. Remember Jessica Martinez? Your father's former accountant who resigned after questioning certain financial discrepancies. She's been working with me for the past 3 years, documenting every questionable transaction. And Michael Chen from Legal Compliance? The one you had fired for being too thorough in his audits. He's been particularly helpful in building the SEC case. The ballroom had become a sea of whispered conversations and furiously typing fingers as Boston's elite realized they were witnessing the fall of one of their own. Several of Alexander's business associates were already edging toward the exits, no doubt eager to distance themselves from the impending scandal. Rachel approached me hesitantly, her eyes darting between me and her brother. Sarah? All this time? You were planning this all along? Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and something else. Admiration. Not at first, I admitted, touching my cheek where Alexander's handprint was still visible. At first, I was just trying to survive, like you've been doing. But then I realized survival wasn't enough. The abuse, the corruption, the way they systematically destroy anyone who challenges them. It had to stop. Catherine suddenly appeared beside us, her composure partially restored though her hands still shook. You ungrateful little, she began, but I cut her off. Careful, Catherine. You might want to save your energy for your own legal defense. I nodded toward where Thomas was now being led away in handcuffs, his rights being read as cameras flashed. Those offshore accounts, they're in your name too. Every wire transfer, every suspicious transaction, all traced back to accounts you helped establish. She stumbled backward as if I'd slapped her, her perfectly made-up face draining of color. That's impossible. I never asked questions, never wondered where the money came from, never thought about the lives your family was destroying. I shook my head. That's exactly the problem, Catherine. Your willing blindness made you complicit. Special Agent Chen returned with a female officer. Mrs. Mitchell, we'd like to take your formal statement now. And given the circumstances, we'd recommend filing for an immediate restraining order. I nodded, but first turned back to Rachel. There's another envelope in my office at home. It contains everything you need to file your own divorce papers, including documentation of James's involvement in the company's harassment cover-ups. Her eyes widened as I pressed a business card into her hand. My lawyer is expecting your call. The officer began leading me toward a quieter area, but Alexander's voice cut through the chaos one last time. You think you've won? He shouted, his mask of sophistication completely shattered. You're nothing without the Mitchell name. Nothing! I turned back to him, feeling nothing but pity for the man who had once terrified me. Actually, Alexander, I'm everything I was before you tried to break me, plus 7 years of evidence that will ensure you never hurt another woman again. As I gave my statement to the authorities, I watched the Mitchell empire continue to unravel. Business partners were already releasing statements distancing themselves from the family. Board members were calling emergency meetings. The carefully constructed facade of power and respectability was dissolving faster than anyone could have predicted. My phone buzzed continuously with messages. Old colleagues from my law firm offering support, journalists requesting interviews, and most surprisingly, other women from Boston's elite social circle sharing their own stories of abuse and silence. The dam hadn't just broken, it had shattered completely. You've been planning this for a long time, Agent Chen observed as she reviewed my statement. The level of detail in these documents? You didn't miss anything. 7 years of legal training before I met Alexander, I reminded her. He just never bothered to see me as anything more than a trophy wife. That was his first mistake. I glanced at my phone, noting the time. And in about 5 minutes, every major news outlet in the country will receive detailed documentation of the Mitchell Industries' environmental violations. I thought it would make a nice addition to their evening broadcasts. The agent raised an eyebrow. You're quite thorough. Had to be. Men like Alexander and Thomas Mitchell don't fall easily. You have to dismantle their power structure completely, or they find ways to rebuild it. I watched as Thomas was escorted out through the kitchen entrance, away from the gathered media. His retirement party had become his perp walk. Catherine was being questioned by another agent, her society friends watching from a distance with a mixture of horror and fascination. The women who had once followed her lead in maintaining perfect appearances were now witnessing the cost of that perfection. Several of them were already deleting photos with the Mitchells from their social media accounts, the swift social death that Boston's elite did so well. Sarah. Rachel's voice was quiet beside me. She'd been crying, her perfect makeup finally ruined. What you said about James, about the documentation, it's all there, I assured her. Everything you need to break free. The question is, are you ready to use it? She straightened slightly, a glimmer of her own strength showing through the cracks of her conditioned submission. I think I've been ready for a long time. I just didn't know how. I squeezed her hand, remembering my own moment of realization 7 years ago. That's how they keep us trapped, making us believe we don't know how to escape. But we do. We always did. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. I watched from my suite at the Four Seasons as the Mitchell empire imploded spectacularly across every major news network. The video of Alexander's assault had gone viral, but it was the steady stream of revelations that followed that truly captivated the public's attention. Mitchell Industries CEO and heir arrested on multiple charges, screamed the headlines. Environmental violations, financial fraud, pattern of abuse exposed. The carefully curated image of Boston's most respected family was being shredded in real time, and my phone hadn't stopped ringing since I'd walked out of that ballroom. You need to see this, my lawyer, Diana Wong said as she entered my suite, with her tablet. She'd been managing the legal fallout with ruthless efficiency. 3 more women have come forward with allegations against Alexander. Former employees, all with documentation matching the timeline in our files. I nodded, unsurprised. There will be more. Alexander was always careless with his power. He never imagined anyone would dare to challenge him. I looked out over the Boston skyline, the same view I'd seen from countless charity events where I'd played my role perfectly. What about the SEC investigation? Moving faster than expected, your documentation was impeccable. Diana smiled grimly. Thomas Mitchell's heart attack in custody certainly accelerated things. Nothing like a medical emergency to make board members start cooperating. The news of Thomas's heart attack had broken that morning. He'd collapsed while being questioned about the offshore accounts, the stress of his empire crumbling finally, proving too much for him. Catherine had rushed to the hospital perfectly coiffed even in crisis, but the damage was done. The mighty Mitchell patriarch had been reduced to a patient in a hospital gown, his handcuffs temporarily removed for medical treatment. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. James just got served with divorce papers. He's threatening to expose family secrets. I told him you beat him to it. A small smile crossed my face. Rachel's transformation over the past 2 days had been remarkable. With the weight of family obligation lifted, she was rediscovering her own strength. Mrs. Mitchell? One of the hotel staff appeared at the door. There's a Ms. Emma Carter here to see you. She says she used to work for your husband? I recognized the name immediately. Alexander's latest executive assistant, the young woman I'd watched him manipulating at the party. Send her in. Emma entered hesitantly, looking much younger without her professional armor. I saw everything. On the news? She began, twisting her hands nervously. The other assistants, they told me about what he... Sit down, Emma. I gestured to the couch. Tell me everything he said to you, everything he promised. We'll add it to the record. As she spoke, describing the same pattern of manipulation I'd documented so many times before, I received another alert. The Mitchell Industries board had called an emergency meeting. Alexander had been formally removed as CEO, and the company's stock was in freefall. They're saying you destroyed the company, Emma said quietly when she finished her statement. The Mitchell legacy destroyed itself, I corrected her. I just exposed the rot that was already there. I handed her the card for my lawyer. Your testimony could help ensure he never does this to another woman. My phone buzzed again. Catherine, finally. I put it on speaker as Diana took notes. How dare you? Her voice trembled with rage. Thomas is in intensive care because of you. Our family name is ruined. Are you satisfied with what you've done? Actually, Catherine, Thomas is in intensive care because of his own actions. The family name is ruined because of what you all did, not because I exposed it. I kept my voice calm, professional. How's the hospital's PR team handling it? I imagine they're not thrilled about treating Boston's newest high-profile criminal. She made a sound somewhere between a sob and a snarl. The hospital board. They've asked me to step down from the fundraising committee. 30 years of service and 30 years of using charity work to mask corruption. I finished for her. Tell me, how many of your society friends are still taking your calls? The silence that followed was answer enough. Boston's elite were experts at social excision, and the Mitchells were now radioactive. The charity boards, the social committees, the country club memberships, all the trappings of power that Catherine had wielded so effectively were being stripped away. We made you, she hissed finally. You were nothing before us. No, Catherine. I was a Harvard-educated lawyer before you. And now? I glanced at Diana, who nodded encouragingly. Now I'm the woman who exposed systemic abuse and corruption in one of Boston's most powerful families. Which of those sounds like nothing to you? After she hung up, Diana updated me on the latest developments. The environmental groups are filing a class action lawsuit. The evidence you gathered about the covered-up toxic spills, it's bigger than anyone realized, and the victims' rights organizations want you to speak at their next conference. I walked to the window again, watching the sun set over the city. 7 years ago, I'd stood in the Mitchell mansion watching the same sunset, planning my escape. Now I was watching their empire fall from the same heights they'd once lorded over. My phone lit up with another message, this time from Caroline, one of Catherine's closest friends. I need to talk. About Richard. About what he's been doing. Another crack in the facade. Another woman finding her voice. The FBI wants to do a formal interview tomorrow, Diana said, gathering her papers. They're particularly interested in the offshore accounts, your documentation of the money trails. It's leading them to other families, other corporations. I wasn't surprised. The Mitchells hadn't operated in a vacuum. Their world was built on mutual protection, wealthy families and corporations covering for each other's transgressions. By exposing one, I'd pulled a thread that was unraveling the entire tapestry. Sarah? Emma spoke up from the couch. What happens now? To all of us Now? I sat beside her, remembering my own journey from victim to victor. Now we make sure this story isn't just about the fall of the Mitchell family. It's about every woman they silenced, every victim they paid off, every life they tried to control. And we make sure it never happens again. As if on cue, my tablet lit up with a breaking news alert. Mitchell Industries scandal prompts federal investigation into corporate abuse cover-ups. The ripples were becoming waves, and the waves were becoming a tsunami. The carefully maintained power structure that had protected men like Alexander for generations was facing a reckoning, and I had the evidence to fuel it all. 1 month after the night that shattered the Mitchell dynasty, I stood in my new corner office at Morrison & Zhang, one of Boston's top law firms. The view wasn't as spectacular as the one from the Mitchell mansion, but it was mine. Earned, through my own merit, not married into or gifted through submission. Your 9 o'clock is here, my assistant announced. Another former Mitchell Industries executive assistant. I nodded, straightening my blazer. The leather chair behind my desk no longer felt foreign. It felt like coming home. In the past month, I'd returned to practicing law, but with a new focus, representing victims of corporate abuse and helping them find their voice, just as I had found mine. The morning news played silently on my office TV. Alexander's bail hearing had been denied again. The judge, a woman who had once attended Catherine's charity galas, had cited the overwhelming evidence of witness tampering attempts. Even from behind bars, Alexander couldn't stop trying to control the narrative. Ms. Carter and 3 other former assistants are ready to testify, Diana reported, entering with a stack of files. The DA is building a strong case. Between the assault charges, the financial crimes, and the harassment pattern, he's not getting out anytime soon. I finished. The thought brought no joy, only a sense of justice finally being served. What about Thomas? Still in the hospital under guard. The doctors say the stress has taken its toll. Catherine's trying to use his health to generate sympathy in the press. But, Diana shrugged. The evidence you gathered is too damning. No one's buying the victim narrative anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Just signed the lease on my own apartment. First time living alone in my life. It's terrifying and amazing. I smiled, remembering my own first taste of true independence. Rachel had flourished in the wake of the scandal, finally breaking free from the gilded cage of Mitchell family expectations. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was systemic. 3 other prominent Boston families had faced federal investigations in the wake of the Mitchell scandal. My documentation had exposed a network of corruption that had protected abusers and silenced victims for generations. The carefully maintained power structure was crumbling, and from its ruins, something new was emerging. The women's shelter called, Diana mentioned. They want you to speak at their fundraiser next month. Your story is inspiring others to come forward. I glanced at the framed news article on my wall. Mitchell family scandal sparks corporate culture revolution. The story had grown beyond one family's downfall. It had become a catalyst for change, inspiring other women to document, to speak up, to fight back. Sarah? My assistant appeared again. Catherine Mitchell is in the lobby. She's demanding to see you. I exchanged looks with Diana, who immediately reached for her phone to call security. But I held up my hand. No, let her come up. It's time. We had this conversation. Catherine entered my office like a ghost of her former self. Her designer outfit was still impeccable, her makeup perfect, but something had crumbled behind her eyes. The steel spine of superiority that had kept her posture rigid through decades of looking the other way had finally broken. "They're selling the house," she said without preamble, sinking into one of my client chairs. "The board is liquidating assets to pay for the environmental cleanup. 40 years of memories, just gone." Memories of what, Catherine? Of teaching generation after generation of women to accept abuse as the price of privilege? Of watching your son become a predator and calling it strength? She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "You don't understand. We built that legacy. You built a fortress of lies," I corrected her. "And now that it's crumbling, you're finally seeing the prison it really was." Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse. "The hospital board, the charity committees, the country club. They've all cut ties. Even my closest friends won't return my calls. You've destroyed everything we built." "No, Catherine. You destroyed it by choosing power over justice, status over truth, appearance over reality. I just exposed what was already rotten at the core." She pulled out a folded newspaper, the society pages she'd once ruled over. Now they were filled with stories of the Mitchell family's disgrace. Thomas may never leave the hospital. Alexander is facing years in prison. The family name is finally bearing the weight of its true legacy, I finished. "Tell me, how many other wives did you counsel to stay quiet? How many other victims did you help silence in the name of maintaining appearances?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken confessions. Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers twisted in her lap, decades of complicity finally catching up with her. "I'm starting a foundation," I told her, my voice softening slightly. "For women trapped in abusive corporate cultures. Women who need help documenting, building cases, finding their way out. You could help, Catherine. You could finally use your experience to protect women instead of the men who hurt them." She looked up sharply, surprise cracking through her practiced facade. "Why would you want my help? After everything? Because you know the playbook better than anyone. You helped write it. Now you could help expose it, help other women recognize the signs before they're trapped in the same cycle." Her breath caught, decades of rigid control wavering. I don't know how to be anything else, anyone else." "None of us did at first," I said, thinking of Rachel, of Emma, of all the women who were finding their voices in the wake of the Mitchell fall. "But we learned, we grew, we transformed." As Catherine left my office, I turned to the window, watching the Boston skyline shimmer in the morning light. The same city that had witnessed the Mitchell family's reign now watched its reckoning. But more importantly, it was witnessing an awakening. My phone buzzed with another message, a former executive's wife, reaching out for help documenting her own story of abuse and survival. The revolution wasn't just about bringing down the powerful. It was about empowering the silenced to reclaim their voices, their dignity, their lives. "Your next appointment is here," my assistant announced. "Another survivor ready to tell her story." I smiled, remembering the long journey from that first moment of recognition to this new chapter of purpose. The transformation wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who found the courage to say enough, to document, to fight back. The Mitchell legacy was indeed over, but from its ashes, something far more powerful had risen. A movement of women who refused to be silenced, who turned their pain into power, their documentation into deliverance, their survival into strength. 3 months after the night that changed everything, I stood on a different stage, the TEDx platform at Harvard Law School. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was where I'd first met Alexander Mitchell, where he'd first begun weaving his web of control around my ambitions. Now I was here to teach others how to break free from such webs. Documentation is power, I began, my voice carrying across the packed auditorium. In the age of digital footprints and paper trails, silence is no longer the only option for survivors. The red dot of the recording light blinked steadily, broadcasting my message far beyond these walls. In the front row, Rachel sat with Emma and 5 other former Mitchell employees, all now part of our growing advocacy network. Rachel had transformed from the timid society wife into a fierce advocate, using her insider knowledge of Boston's elite circles to identify and reach other trapped women. The pattern is always the same, I continued, clicking through slides that detailed the systematic way abusers maintain control. They isolate you, diminish your sense of self-worth, make you dependent on their approval. But technology has given us new weapons in this fight. Every email, every text, every financial transaction leaves a trace. And when we learn to gather these traces systematically, we build an arsenal of truth. The presentation included redacted examples from my own documentation, the spreadsheets tracking financial abuse, the recorded conversations revealing manipulation, the carefully dated photographs of bruises and property damage. Each piece of evidence a brick in the wall of accountability I'd built. But the most powerful documentation isn't just about gathering evidence, I explained, moving to the heart of my message. It's about reclaiming your narrative. Every time you record an incident, save a threatening message, or photograph an injury, you're not just collecting proof, you're refusing to let them write your story. My phone buzzed silently in my pocket, probably Diana with updates about the Mitchell Industries criminal case. The proceedings had become a landmark case in corporate accountability, with implications reaching far beyond Boston's elite circles. The Mitchell case wasn't just about one family's fall from grace, I acknowledged, addressing the elephant in the room. It exposed a system of protection that had enabled abuse across generations. But more importantly, it provided a blueprint for dismantling similar systems. In the audience, I spotted several faces from other prominent Boston families, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and recognition. The Mitchell scandal had sent shockwaves through their world, forcing many to confront their own complicity in maintaining the status quo. Since that night, our organization has helped over 50 women document and escape abusive situations in corporate environments, I reported, pride evident in my voice. But documentation alone isn't enough. We need to change the culture that makes such documentation necessary. The screen behind me filled with headlines from the past 3 months. Mitchell case sparks corporate culture reform. Boston elite. Face reckoning in wake of abuse scandal. New legislature proposed for corporate accountability in abuse cases. The foundation we've established, I continued, provides not just legal support, but technical training in documentation techniques, digital security, and evidence preservation. We're teaching women to be their own advocates, their own investigators, their own saviors. After the presentation, Rachel joined me backstage, her eyes bright with purpose. 3 more wives from the country club reached out this morning, she reported. They're ready to talk, ready to document. I squeezed her hand, remembering how far she'd come from that trembling woman at the retirement party. How's the support? Group going? Growing every week? Catherine actually came to the last session? Rachel's voice held a mix of emotions at mentioning her mother. She's different now. She's starting to understand her role in perpetuating the cycle. My phone buzzed again, this time a news alert. Alexander's trial date had been set. The evidence was overwhelming: financial fraud, physical abuse, witness tampering, environmental violations. The Mitchell heir was facing decades in prison, and his father's health continued to decline in the hospital's secure wing. Ms. Reynolds? A young law student approached hesitantly, using my maiden name. I'd reclaimed it the day after the retirement party. Your story. It gave me the courage to start documenting my boyfriend's behavior. I didn't even realize it was abuse until I heard you speak about the patterns. This was the real victory, not just bringing down one powerful family, but awakening consciousness in others. Every woman who recognized her situation, who began documenting, who found her voice, was another crack in the foundation of systemic abuse. The DA's office called, Diana reported, joining us with her ever-present tablet. They want to use our documentation method as a template for other cases. They're calling it the Mitchell Protocol, systematic evidence gathering for abuse victims. I smiled at the irony. The Mitchell name would indeed leave a legacy, just not the one they'd intended. Instead of standing for power and privilege, it would become synonymous with accountability and justice. The Harvard Law Review wants to publish an article about the case, Diana continued, specifically about how your legal training informed your documentation strategy. They're interested in making it part of the curriculum. The symmetry was perfect. The institution where I'd first encountered the Mitchell world of privilege and power would now teach students how to combat such abuse. The cycle wasn't just broken, it was being rebuilt into something empowering. Later that evening, I received an unexpected email from Catherine. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." Inside was a lengthy confession of her own journey from victim to enabler, and her commitment to helping other women break free. Attached was a document titled The Society Wife's Handbook, Recognizing and Documenting Abuse in Elite Circles. I spent decades teaching women how to survive in this world, she wrote. Now I want to teach them how to change it. The movement we'd started wasn't just about documenting abuse or exposing corruption. It was about transforming pain into power, silence into strength, and survival into solidarity. Each woman who stepped forward, each story documented, each system challenged, added another voice to the chorus of change. My phone lit up with another message. Emma, sharing news that 2 more Mitchell Industries executives had been indicted. The dominoes were still falling, each new revelation exposing more of the corrupt system that had protected abusers for generations. Ready for tomorrow's workshop? Rachel asked, reviewing the schedule for our documentation training session. 20 women from various corporate environments would learn how to gather evidence, protect themselves, and prepare for their own moments of truth. Ready, I confirmed, thinking of how far we'd all come from that night at the Sterling Hotel. Every woman deserves to know she has the power to write her own ending. The red mark from Alexander's slap had long since faded, but its impact continued to ripple through Boston's corporate world, transforming lives and challenging power structures that had seemed untouchable. Sometimes the greatest catalyst for change isn't the pain we endure, but the strength we find in documenting our truth and refusing to be silenced. 6 months after the slap that shattered the Mitchell dynasty, I stood in my old Harvard law classroom, now as a guest lecturer. The familiar space held different energy. Instead of eager first years dreaming of corporate success, I faced a room full of students specifically interested in corporate accountability and victim advocacy. The Mitchell case wasn't just about documenting abuse, I explained, pacing the wooden floors I'd once walked as a student. It was about understanding how power structures protect themselves and how to systematically dismantle them. The projector displayed excerpts from my documentation system, financial records, incident logs, conversation transcripts, all meticulously organized and preserved. What had started as self-preservation had evolved into a comprehensive methodology now being taught in law schools across the country. Yesterday, Alexander Mitchell was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, I announced, though everyone in the room already knew. The case had made national headlines, becoming a symbol of changing times in corporate America. But the real victory isn't in his conviction. It's in the changes his case has inspired. In the back of the classroom sat Rachel and Emma, both now regular speakers at our advocacy workshops. Rachel had transformed her society connections into a network for identifying and helping other trapped women, while Emma led our corporate whistleblower protection program. The Mitchell Protocol, I continued, has now been adopted by 12 major law firms and 3 federal agencies. What began as one woman's documentation of abuse has become a standardized system for building cases against powerful abusers. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Another Mitchell Industries executive had just pleaded guilty to financial fraud charges. The dominoes were still falling, each new conviction exposing more of the corrupt network that had protected abusers for generations. But perhaps the most significant change, I said, clicking to the next slide, is happening right here in law schools and corporate training programs. We're teaching the next generation to recognize and document abuse before it becomes entrenched. The screen showed statistics from our foundation's first 6 months. Over 200 women assisted, 43 cases filed, 16 corporations under investigation. Numbers that represented not just legal victories, but lives transformed. The key Mitchell name used to represent power and privilege, I acknowledged. Now it stands for something else. A warning about the cost of unchecked authority and a blueprint for challenging it. After the lecture, a student approached me. Young, determined, with that same fire I'd once had before Alexander tried to extinguish it. Ms. Reynolds, your story. It's helping me document things in my own relationship. I never realized emotional abuse could be proven until I learned about your methods. This was the real legacy, not just the fall of one powerful family, but the empowerment of countless individuals who'd previously felt helpless against abuse. Every woman who learned to document, every victim who found their voice, was another crack in the foundation of systemic oppression. Sarah. Catherine's voice surprised me as I left the classroom. She looked different now, less rigid, more human. The perfectly maintained facade had given way to something more authentic. I've been working with the Foundation's legal team. We've identified 3 more families with patterns similar to what we had. The transformation in my former mother-in-law had been unexpected but profound. After Thomas suffered a second heart attack in custody and was permanently moved to a secure medical facility, Catherine had finally begun confronting her role in maintaining the cycle of abuse. The country club set isn't happy with me, she admitted, walking with me across the campus. But I keep thinking about all the young wives I groomed over the years, teaching them to accept what I'd accepted. I need to make that right. My phone lit up with another update. The Mitchell Industries board had voted to rename the company, distancing themselves from the scandal. The Mitchell name, once synonymous with Boston elite, was being erased from buildings and charitable foundations across the city. Have you seen the latest corporate training program? Rachel joined us, tablet in hand. They're using footage from Alexander's retirement party as a case study in recognizing abuse patterns. That slap heard around Boston is now teaching HR departments nationwide. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The very moment that was supposed to reinforce Alexander's power had become a tool for dismantling similar power structures throughout corporate America. The Foundation received 3 more applications for legal assistance this morning, Rachel continued. All from women in positions similar to where I was, corporate wives documenting abuse in prominent families. We reached the law school's main entrance, where a group of students was setting up for a workshop on digital evidence gathering. The next generation of lawyers wasn't just learning about corporate law. They were learning how to challenge corporate abuse. Sometimes I wonder, Catherine mused, watching the students, how different things might have been if someone had taught me to document when I first married Thomas. If I'd known I had options beyond silence. That's why this matters, I replied, thinking of all the women still trapped in cycles of abuse. We're not just providing legal support. We're showing them there's a way out, that their stories matter, that they can rewrite their own endings. Later that evening, in my office at the foundation, I reviewed the latest impact report. The Mitchell Protocol had been downloaded over 10,000 times. Support group attendance had tripled. Corporate accountability seminars were booked months in advance. A news alert popped up on my screen. Another prominent Boston family was under investigation, their patterns of abuse and financial misconduct exposed by a wife who'd learned from our documentation methods. The ripple effects continued to spread. "Your 7 o'clock is here," my assistant announced. Another corporate wife recommended by Catherine. She's been documenting for 3 months. I smiled, remembering my own journey from trapped victim to empowered advocate. "Send her in. It's time to help her write her own ending." The woman who entered looked like I had 7 months ago, perfectly polished on the surface, but with that gleam of determination in her eyes. In her designer handbag, she carried a USB drive and a stack of papers, her own arsenal of truth, meticulously gathered. "I've been following your story," she said, hands trembling slightly as she laid out her evidence. "I never thought documentation could be so powerful until I saw what you did with it." "Documentation isn't just about gathering evidence," I told her, thinking of that night at the Sterling Hotel, of the slap that had sparked a movement. "It's about reclaiming your narrative. Every piece of evidence you collect is another word in your story of survival." As we began reviewing her documentation, I thought about how far we'd all come. The Mitchell legacy hadn't ended with Alexander's slap or his conviction. It had transformed into something powerful and positive. Each woman who learned to document, each victim who found their voice, each abuser held accountable, was part of this new legacy. The slap that was meant to reinforce my submission had instead catalyzed a revolution. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in the ability to inflict pain, but in the strength to document it, expose it, and transform it into positive change. 1 year after the slap that changed everything, I found myself back at the Sterling Hotel. The grand ballroom where Alexander had shattered our marriage now hosted the inaugural gala for the Women's Corporate Accountability Foundation. The irony of the venue choice wasn't lost on anyone. "Quite different from last year's party," Rachel commented, joining me at the entrance. She'd traded her usual society wife pastels for a powerful red suit, her transformation from victim to advocate complete. "Hard to believe it's only been a year." The room buzzed with energy, but it wasn't the artificial charm of Boston's elite this time. Instead, survivors, advocates, and corporate reform leaders filled the space. The crystal chandeliers that had witnessed Alexander's violence now illuminated a celebration of transformation. The final Mitchell Industries settlement was approved. "This morning?" Diana reported, tablet in hand as always. "The Environmental Cleanup Fund is fully funded, and the Victim Compensation Program is operational." She smiled grimly. Thomas had a fit when they told him in the hospital, but given his condition, there's not much he can do about it. The mighty Mitchell patriarch had never recovered from his second heart attack. Now he spent his days in a secure medical facility. His empire dismantled, his legacy transformed into a cautionary tale. Catherine had visited him yesterday, their first meeting in months. "He still doesn't understand," she'd told me afterward, her voice heavy with newly found wisdom. "He keeps talking about family reputation, about loyalty. He can't see that his definition of loyalty was just another word for submission." My phone buzzed with a news alert. Alexander's appeal had been denied. The evidence I'd gathered over those 7 years had proven unshakable. His attempts to claim emotional distress and temporary insanity had fallen flat against the methodical documentation of his pattern of abuse. "Your keynote speech is in 20 minutes, my assistant reminded me. CNN is carrying it live, and the online stream has over 50,000 viewers already. The Foundation's work had caught national attention. Our documentation protocols were being implemented in corporations and law firms across the country. What had started as one woman's survival strategy had evolved into a movement for systematic change. Sarah. Emma approached, now serving as our Foundation's corporate outreach director. The new support group numbers just came in. We've helped over 500 women start documentation processes this year alone. I remembered Emma as she'd been that night, young, vulnerable, another potential victim in Alexander's pattern. Now she led our initiatives to protect corporate whistleblowers and support victims of workplace abuse. The Princeton Law Review article is trending, Rachel added, showing me her phone. My analysis of how abusers use corporate resources to maintain control had sparked academic discussions nationwide. 3 more universities want to add the Mitchell Protocol to their curriculum. As I prepared to take the stage, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the ballroom's ornate mirrors. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the careful society wife I'd been a year ago. My power didn't come from designer labels or social connections anymore. It came from truth, from strength, from the ability to help others find their voice. Distinguished guests, the evening's host began. Please welcome Sarah Reynolds, founder of the Women's Corporate Accountability Foundation. The applause that greeted me wasn't the polite society clapping I'd known in my Mitchell years. It was the sound of genuine appreciation, of lives changed, of hope renewed. 1 year ago, in this very room, I began, a man slapped his wife in front of Boston's elite, expecting compliance, silence, submission. Instead, he got a revolution. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Somewhere in his prison cell, Alexander would probably see this broadcast. The thought no longer sparked fear, only a sense of justice served. But this story isn't about one family's fall from grace, I continued. It's about dismantling the systems that protect abusers and silence victims. It's about transforming documentation from a survival strategy into a tool for change. Catherine sat in the front row, herself a symbol of transformation. She'd traded her society queen persona for something more authentic, using her insider knowledge to help other women recognize and escape abuse. In the past year, our foundation has trained over 2,000 women in documentation techniques. We've helped launch 15 corporate accountability initiatives. We've supported the passage of 3 state laws strengthening protections for abuse survivors. The statistics flowed across the screens behind me. Lives changed, cases won, systems reformed. But the numbers couldn't capture the personal transformations, the individual moments of awakening and empowerment. The Mitchell Protocol isn't just about gathering evidence, I explained. It's about reclaiming your story. Every document saved, every incident recorded, every pattern exposed is an act of resistance. It's saying, I refuse to be silenced. I refuse to disappear. I refuse to let you write my ending. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 25, reminding me of myself when I'd first met Alexander. Your story saved my life, she said quietly. I was engaged to a man like Alexander. Everything you described, the control, the manipulation, the subtle threats. I started documenting after I read about your case. Last month, I finally had enough evidence to leave safely. These moments made everything worthwhile. The years of careful planning, the night of confrontation, the months of legal battles. Every woman who found her voice, who escaped abuse, who reclaimed her power, was a victory. We're expanding the Foundation's reach, Diana announced during our post-gala meeting. 3 new international chapters opening next quarter. The Mitchell Protocol is being translated into 12 languages. The ripple effects continued to spread, far beyond Boston's elite circles. What had started as one woman's careful documentation had become a global movement for corporate accountability and survivor empowerment. It's strange, Rachel mused as We left the ballroom that had witnessed both our lowest and highest moments. A year ago, we were trapped in their version of power. Now we're creating our own. I touched my cheek, remembering the sting of Alexander's slap. The mark had faded long ago, but its impact continued to resonate through boardrooms and bedrooms across the country. Sometimes the greatest power comes not from the ability to inflict pain, but from the strength to document it, expose it, and transform it into change. The Mitchell name would indeed leave a legacy, just not the one they'd intended. Instead of standing for power through control, it now represented power through truth. Every woman who learned to document, every victim who found their voice, every abuser held accountable was part of this new legacy. The revolution that started with a slap in a Boston ballroom had become a movement for justice, accountability, and transformation. And we were just getting started. 18 months after Alexander's slap echoed through the Sterling Hotel ballroom, I stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. The Mitchell Protocol had moved beyond corporate boardrooms and legal classrooms. It was now being considered as the framework for federal legislation on corporate accountability and abuse prevention. Documentation isn't just about gathering evidence, I testified, my voice carrying through the historic chamber. It's about giving survivors a weapon against silence, a shield against gaslighting, and a voice against power. What began as one woman's survival strategy has become a movement for systematic change. The committee members listened intently as I detailed the impact of our work. In the audience sat Rachel, Emma, and Catherine, each representing different aspects of transformation. Rachel, now leading our advocacy training program, Emma, directing corporate reform initiatives, and Catherine, using her insider knowledge to expose abuse patterns in elite circles. The Mitchell case wasn't unique, I continued. It simply exposed what many women had known for generations, that power structures protect abusers through silence, shame, and systematic suppression of evidence. But technology has changed the game. Every email, every text, every financial transaction leaves a trail. We're teaching women to use these trails to build their cases and reclaim their power. My phone buzzed silently, another news alert about Alexander. He'd attempted to appeal his conviction again, claiming mental distress. The courts had denied it, citing the overwhelming evidence I'd gathered over those 7 years. His prison term would stand. In the 18 months since implementing the Mitchell Protocol, I reported, our foundation has helped over 3,000 women document abuse in corporate settings. We've supported the filing of 28 class action lawsuits against systematic abusers. We've trained over 500 legal professionals in evidence-gathering techniques specifically designed for abuse cases. Senator Elizabeth Chen leaned forward. Ms. Reynolds, your protocol has been adopted by 12 state prosecutors' offices and 3 federal agencies. Did you anticipate this level of institutional impact when you began documenting your own abuse? The question made me think back to those early days, secretly saving emails, recording conversations, photographing bruises. No, Senator. At first, I was just trying to survive. But as I built my case, I realized this wasn't just about escaping one abusive marriage. It was about exposing and dismantling the systems that protect abusers. After the hearing, Diana met me with updates from Boston. The Mitchell Industries building, once a monument to corporate power, was being converted into a women's advocacy center. Thomas had finally been deemed unfit to stand trial, his empire dismantled from his hospital bed. The Mitchell name was being removed from charitable foundations and university buildings across New England. The Harvard Law Review article has gone viral again, Diana reported. 3 more law schools are adding abuse documentation techniques to their required curriculum. The Mitchell Protocol is becoming standard training in corporate HR departments nationwide. We'd created something that transcended personal revenge or individual justice. The movement had taken on a life of its own, empowering survivors and challenging power structures across society. Sarah. Catherine approached, looking more human than I'd ever seen her during my marriage to Alexander. The support group network has expanded to 15 cities. Women are finally finding their voices, their strength. They're learning what I wish I'd known 40 years ago. Her transformation had been perhaps the most surprising. The woman who had once enforced the code of silence in Boston's elite circles now led initiatives to expose and document abuse patterns in high society. The latest corporate accountability report is in, Rachel added, joining us with her tablet. 37 companies have implemented our documentation protocols. Reported incidents of workplace harassment are up 300%, not because there's more abuse, but because women finally feel empowered to report it. My phone lit up with a message from Emma. Just finished training another group of corporate whistleblowers. They all mentioned your story as their inspiration to start documenting. The ripple effects continued to spread, each survivor becoming an advocate, each advocate empowering more survivors. That evening, I returned to my hotel room to find an unexpected email from James, Rachel's ex-husband. "I'm in therapy now," he wrote. "The Mitchell Protocol made me confront my own behavior. I'm learning to be different, to be better. Your documentation didn't just expose abuse. It forced us abusers to see ourselves clearly. This was an unforeseen impact of our work, not just empowering survivors, but compelling abusers to confront their actions. The protocol wasn't just catching abuse, it was preventing it. Your media appearance is confirmed for tomorrow," my assistant reminded me. Good Morning America wants to focus on the preventive aspects of the protocol, how documentation can stop abuse before it escalates. I thought about Alexander's slap, how he'd expected it to reinforce his control. Instead, it had become a catalyst for change, a moment that inspired thousands of women to start documenting, to build their cases, to reclaim their power. The next morning, as I prepared for the interview, I received another update from Diana. The Mitchell Foundation for Corporate Accountability, renamed and repurposed from one of Thomas's old charitable trusts, had received a major grant to expand its training programs internationally. "We're taking the protocol global," Diana explained. "Women in corporate settings worldwide are learning to document, to gather evidence, to protect themselves. The Mitchell name is becoming synonymous with survivor empowerment, not abuser protection. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so powerful. The family that had tried to silence me had instead given me a platform to amplify thousands of voices." Looking back, I told the GMA host, that slap wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the end of my silence. Every woman deserves to know she has the power to document, to expose, to change her narrative. As the interview concluded, my phone buzzed with messages from survivors around the country, women who'd used the protocol to escape abuse, to build cases, to transform their lives. Each message represented another crack in the foundation of systematic abuse, another voice refusing to be silenced. The Mitchell Protocol had become more than a documentation system. It was a movement, a revolution in how society handles abuse. And accountability. What started with one woman's careful planning had evolved into a global force for change. "Your next speaking engagement is at the International Corporate Ethics Summit," my assistant reminded me. "They want you to train executives from 50 countries in implementing the protocol." I smiled, thinking of that night in the Sterling Hotel ballroom. Alexander had tried to slap me into submission, but instead, he'd unleashed a power he never could have imagined. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from the ability to inflict pain, but from the courage to document it, expose it, and transform it into lasting change. The revolution that began with a slap had become a legacy of empowerment, accountability, and transformation. And for every woman who found her voice, who built her case, who reclaimed her power, that legacy grew stronger. The Mitchell name would indeed be remembered, not as a symbol of power and privilege, but as a reminder that documentation is power, truth is strength, and no system of abuse is too big to dismantle when survivors stand together. 2 years to the day after Alexander's palm struck my face in that elegant ballroom, I sat in my home office, reviewing the impact our work had created. The red leather chair that had once symbolized my corporate wife status now represented something entirely different. A platform for change, a seat of power earned through courage rather than marriage. The evening news played silently on my wall-mounted screen. Alexander's latest appeal had been denied, ensuring he would serve his full sentence. Thomas Mitchell had passed away in the secure medical facility last month, taking his old world, patriarchal beliefs with him to the grave. The Mitchell Empire, once a symbol of Boston's elite power structure, had been completely dismantled and transformed. My phone lit up with a text from Rachel. Just finished another training session. 5 more corporate wives started their documentation today. The cycle keeps breaking. She'd found her calling in helping other women recognize and escape the patterns we'd both lived through. Catherine had sent an email earlier. She was speaking at a women's empowerment conference in London, sharing her journey from enabler to advocate. Her transformation had been perhaps the most profound, using her intimate knowledge of abusive power structures to help dismantle them from within. The latest statistics are in, Diana's message read. The Mitchell Protocol has been adopted by over 500 organizations worldwide. Documented cases of corporate abuse are up 400%. Not because abuse increased, but because women finally have the tools and support to expose it. Emma, now running our corporate accountability division, had just published a groundbreaking study on the psychological impact of systematic documentation on abuse survivors. Documentation isn't just about gathering evidence, she wrote. It's about reclaiming your narrative, one piece of evidence at a time. I turned to my window, watching the Boston skyline shimmer in the evening light. The same city that had witnessed the Mitchell family's reign now stood as a beacon of corporate accountability and survivor empowerment. The foundation's headquarters occupied the former Mitchell Industries building, a transformation that felt both poetic and powerful. My reflection in the window caught my eye. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the careful corporate wife of 2 years ago. The mask of submission had been replaced by an authentic strength, the practiced smile by genuine purpose. The sting of Alexander's slap had faded, but its impact continued to ripple through boardrooms and bedrooms across the globe. "Your mother would be proud," my father had said recently, his eyes misting as he watched me testify before Congress. "She always said you had a fighter's spirit." He'd been right. The spirit was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The Mitchell Protocol had become more than a documentation system. It was a movement, a revolution in how society handles power and accountability. Every woman who started documenting, every survivor who found her voice, every abuser exposed and held accountable added another chapter to this evolving story. What began with one woman's careful planning had become a global force for change. The slap that was meant to ensure my submission had instead unleashed a power that transformed not just my life, but the lives of countless others. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in our ability to endure pain, but in our courage to document it, expose it, and transform it into something powerful. Every piece of evidence gathered, every pattern exposed, every truth revealed becomes another crack in the foundation of systematic abuse. As I prepare to share this story with you, I'm reminded that documentation isn't just about gathering evidence. It's about reclaiming our narratives, our power, our lives. The Mitchell name will indeed leave a legacy, but not the one they intended. Instead of representing power through control, it now stands for power through truth. To every woman documenting her story, gathering her evidence, finding her voice, you are not alone. Your truth matters. Your evidence matters. Your story matters. Remember, The same hands that once hurt you can ultimately lead to your liberation, not through their strength, but through your courage to document their actions. Every text saved, every email archived, every incident recorded is another step toward freedom. The revolution that started with a slap in a Boston ballroom continues to grow, one documented truth at a time. And for every woman who finds the strength to start gathering evidence, to break free, to reclaim her power, this story grows stronger. Because in the end, the most powerful legacy isn't built on silence and submission. It's built on truth, courage, and the unwavering determination to transform pain into power, one piece of evidence at a time. The Mitchell Protocol isn't just a method of documentation. It's a testament to the power of systematic resistance, a reminder that no abuser is too powerful to be exposed, no system too entrenched to be dismantled when survivors stand together. As I close this chapter of my story, I want you to remember, your documentation is your power. Your evidence is your voice. Your truth is your strength. The slap that was meant to silence me instead gave voice to thousands. May this story give you the courage to start documenting, the strength to keep gathering evidence, and the power to rewrite your own ending. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't in getting even. It's in getting free and helping others find their way to freedom too. Thank you for being part of this journey. Keep documenting. Keep fighting. Keep transforming pain into power. Your truth matters. Your evidence matters. Your story matters. And together, we'll continue rewriting the legacy of power, one documented truth at a time.